Hey there, this video is going to mark our first foray on the channel into a critique and analysis of Pathfinder 2. Now, there are a lot of other channels doing work on this topic, and so this one is going to be a shorter video to kick things off about a very particular sort of design philosophy and stance that I think informed a great deal of Pathfinder 2's design. When you're consulting the official stuff that Paizo and its dignitaries have been putting out there, it doesn't take very long to discover that a data-driven approach was taken to the beta of Pathfinder 2. A great deal of work and effort went into creating the surveys that the beta testers would fill out, to turning that data in the surveys into something actionable for the designers, and ultimately the changes that were made to Pathfinder 2 after the initial beta release are largely a result of that feedback. And some of it I'm very positive on, like the elimination of the resonance system in magic items. But there's a very specific subset of folks that provided that feedback. There are people who were attuned to the Pathfinder beta, who received it as a mostly complete game that they could have a hand in changing, and not as sort of a sneak preview to be read over and discarded until official release. By the admission of the designers, the most influential feedback was the answers to the questions, the strongly agree, somewhat agree, strongly disagree questions that were provided in the surveys. So the sort of changes that were made were based on feedback to questions that those inside of Paizo decided were important questions. If you didn't like Pathfinder 2 for a reason that they weren't asking about, there wasn't a lot of ways within this data-driven approach for you as a beta tester or someone just reacting to the beta to influence what the final game of Pathfinder 2 would become. And this is the first instance of survivorship bias in the design of Pathfinder 2. The changes that were made to the beta were the changes requested by survivors. Now, I think it's time to go into a little vignette about what survivorship bias means. In World War II, many planes were flying over German airspace and being bombarded by flat guns, and they were raked. They came back to the Allied airfields riddled with holes in all sorts of places, and a rigorous statistical analysis began of where those planes had been damaged. It was thought that this might be the most common place that the flat guns hit, and thus it might be the best place to up-armor it. Amidst this process, there was one fellow, a man named Abraham Wald, who observed that they were only analyzing the planes that made it back. The planes that had been struck by flak in areas besides what they were seeing were the planes that were critically damaged and went down over Europe. And I think it's pretty interesting that you don't have to be an aeronautical engineer to take a look at where the red dots were on the planes coming back, and to figure out that the planes that weren't making it back were having their tails shot off, were having the cockpit hit, or were having that space along the wing where the highest aerodynamic load was being borne broken off. Now fast forward to the present day. Your experience with Pathfinder 1 and the Pathfinder 2 beta is by no means as mortal and grim as what the Allied aircrew went through during World War II. But nevertheless, there are a lot of people who stopped playing Pathfinder 1, who found problems with Pathfinder 1 and stopped really paying attention to the brand. They might have had a lot of fun playing Pathfinder 1. It was a serviceable aircraft that could get them up into the skies of imagination. But somewhere along the way, some gremlin got in the works and caused them to choose another RPG, or worse yet, cease playing tabletop RPGs altogether. And this gremlin might have been something of their own making, some negative habit of play or something in the culture of play that put them off about the tabletop role-playing hobby. Or it could have been something about Pathfinder, or something that Pathfinder's design could modulate in a future edition to bring them back into the fold. And yet, my impression is that instead of looking to those folks who were shot down before they ever landed at Pathfinder 2 beta, most of what was done to Pathfinder was done by Pathfinder 1 diehards who were still enjoying the system, still working in the halls at Paizo, and if not in the first flower of love for 3.x D&D, still very much an advocate for the Pathfinder brand. They might have had their pet peeves about what were difficulties in play, but those difficulties had not stopped them from playing Pathfinder. And in some respects, this is a great positive for the folks who were still really in love with Pathfinder 1 when it came time for Pathfinder 2, in the sense that attention was really being paid to putting a balm on some of the saddle sores of 10 years of playing with Pathfinder 1. So now that I've set the stage for you, let's bring in Exhibit A. The action economy. In 3.x D&D, you had a move action, a standard action, and later on, the concept of the swift action was added to the menu of what you could do on your turn. There were certain laws about the fungibility of these actions. A standard action could be transformed into a move action. A move action could be transformed into a swift action, but a swift action could not be transformed into any other kind of action. Likewise, a move action could not become a standard action. And a full round action consumed all of your actions, but maybe not the swift action, I can't actually remember. And spells with a casting time of 1 round, well, that was a different story than a full round action. But you could still take your 5-foot step if you didn't move at all. But a step wasn't actually an action, it was just something that you got if you'd chosen not to move in any other respect. But if you had chosen a withdrawal action, which was a special kind of action, which was a full round action, then you did get to take a 5-foot step before you did the rest of the movement, which was bundled in a withdrawal action. This Baroque and somewhat Leviticus-like set of rules were daunting for many game masters and groups. And from a design standpoint, this action economy really created a lot of problems down the road, especially when it came to haste effects. Because some haste effects that just improved your full round action would be useless to any classes that weren't marshals that were making many attacks around in toe-to-toe contact or volleying arrows from a single space in the ground. Meanwhile, the sort of haste effects that allowed you to take more than one standard action in a round were pretty powerful across the board and could lead to some really crazy combinations that other parts of the rules didn't anticipate. But I gotta tell you, as many times as I had to walk a player through the Byzantine rules that involved the fungibility of different kinds of actions between one another in 3.x, and the admittedly fewer times that I was ever really frustrated with haste magic becoming overpowerful, these two things were just irksome. I never thought about quitting Pathfinder 1 because of these issues. It might have made the learning curve feel a little bit steeper for some of my players when they discovered that they couldn't combine actions in a given way, and what they had visualized was then stymied when it was put into contact with the rules. Sometimes my imagination and my suspension of disbelief, when put into contact with these haste effects and their power level, would have to go outside and take a little bit of a walk and maybe just a long drag on a cigarette before I could come back inside again. I am a former smoker, full disclosure. So these were the sorts of things that I'm sure there were a lot of ranting forum threads about. They were the sort of things that people on the outside of the Pathfinder player base might hear about as kind of annoying things, because the people who were still playing Pathfinder would probably talk their ear off about it. And it probably was in some ways damaging the Pathfinder brand for these issues to persist. So going into Pathfinder 2, it does make sense that these issues ought to be resolved. Just from a commercial perspective, if Paizo didn't have to worry so much about bizarre interactions between the different kinds of actions, then they could make a lot more content for their future game without having to worry about broken combo effects. If there was a hard limit on how many actions you could take in a turn, then Paizo could come out with innumerable, thousands of different kinds of special actions for new classes and new races and new spells that could populate an entire second 10-year life cycle of a new Pathfinder. So the solution that was arrived at for Pathfinder 2 was that each character would get 3 actions in a turn. Moving would cost an action and would be called stride. Likewise, taking what used to be a 5-foot step would become an action, called a step appropriately. And attacking would no longer be a standard action, but just an action, and would be called strike. Some things like spellcasting might consume 2 of your actions in the turn. Meanwhile, jumping up onto tables or stumps to get a better vantage point, climbing up cliff sides to reach an opponent sniping down on you, and swimming would each be parceled off into their own separate actions from movement. So climbing would be something entirely different from striding, and when you transition between the two, you would then have to take a second action. This would seem to make things really nice and tidy in the sense that there would no longer be the chance of you beginning a jump and leaping over a chasm only to freeze in mid-air until the next turn because you had run out of the notional movement on your sheet, and so you would complete the jump 6 seconds later in the fictional space of the combat. Likewise, the different fractional speeds that you were put under when you were swimming or climbing would no longer have to be tracked as an amount that was consumed out of your base movement score. This is another one of those things that was a headache in Pathfinder 1 play. It was something where our imaginations and our suspension of disbelief would really groan when a character would hang in mid-air in the middle of a combat. But ultimately, this was not a reason that I quit playing Pathfinder 1, nor is it a reason that I know anyone else quit Pathfinder 1. It was a thing that we would whine about occasionally, that we would remark upon over beers, that occasionally there would be some arguments at the table over, but the game would go on. But at the end of the day, the reason that Pathfinder 1 and I drifted apart was player downtime. It was the length of time that I watched my friends sit and wait for their turn around the table. When playing with 4 or 5 player characters, it got to be a very long wait before you got to do your thing with your character again. In situations with a high action count, where there were a lot of bodies on the field, either summoned creatures from a cleric or a summoner or wizard, or because there was just a lot of goblins to fight today, or the sort of martial character that really specializes in doing a great many blows in a single round, either by shooting many arrows individually, or a flurry of blows with a monk, or the dual wielder that would approach his craft with celerity and elan, sometimes stacking up 5 attacks in a round. TLDR, when there were more dice to be rolled, there was more waiting to be done before you got to take part in the game. And ultimately, that problem of downtime, of people idling instead of playing and enjoying interacting with one another, got to be too much. Pathfinder 1 was no longer the choice for us as a group. It was no longer the choice for me as a GM, who wanted to see more story unfold and to have the possibility of more than one combat in a session. Now let's tie that all in with our analogy. To me and to my group playing Pathfinder 1, player downtime in combat was the anti-aircraft gun that shot us down before we ever made it to the airfield of Pathfinder 2 beta testing. Yes, the simplification and the elimination of different kinds of actions definitely would save time for us. And yes, there is a certain elegance to daughtering off the different kinds of movement into their own kinds of actions, for the rare occasions where that ever came up for us. But on the whole, each player having 3 actions on their turn means that the waiting game is definitely not going to go away in Pathfinder 2. Indeed, each player must decide what their first action will be, and then resolve it, and then take their next action based on the results of the first, and then roll for that one, and so on. In some cases, say a dwarf wants to hop over a low wall and then move to an enemy, he might have to calculate in his head whether he wants to make 2 movements to go around the wall or to spend 1 to hop over. That sounds like that's going to take some calculus, that's going to take some decision-making time, and it's going to slow down play. And as combat escalates, the thing that I have seen in beta test actual plays of Pathfinder 2 is that very often on people's turns they will find themselves toe-to-toe with the enemy, and they'll be swinging their sword 3 times in succession. That's 3 separate rolls of the d20, each with a different modifier, and each roll might have a damage roll that follows after it that the player is going to have to pick up a die and report the damage for. The perennial problem of backseat quarterbacking of other players' turns, where the most optimization-minded player might give hot tips to other players which they might decline or accept, well, that kind of table talk is multiplied in Pathfinder 2. If your group doesn't mind that kind of outer character play, if your group doesn't mind watching other players take their turns and combat taking an hour or more, then Pathfinder 2 is going to look like an okay game to you. You've already arrived at the airfield. And yet one thing that the book was always closed on during the Pathfinder 2 beta, from day one, was the 3-action economy. 3 actions for players, and 3 actions for each and every monster on the battlefield. Now there are some balms that could remediate this issue, even within the 3-action economy. It is true that fighters have a combined charge and attack dual action that will often eat up a good share of their actions in the turn and reduce the amount of downtime in play. And Raise Shield is a common action that many players probably will take because it allows them to block when it's not their turn, thus reducing the damage that they receive from attacks. But notice these are all choices to be made by a player, and thus it brings in the gremlin of having the quarterbacking issue from other players. It brings in the trouble where the player is kind of consulting this calculus of decision making, and some players will hem and haw over decisions when the decisions are before them. So it seems like the gremlin of player downtime has been made a perennial by the design of Pathfinder 2. The bullet holes in my aircraft flying Pathfinder 1 were never consulted during that initial design phase of Pathfinder 2. The ship had already sailed. At Paizo, there may have been an early decision made to consult the living rather than the dead when it came to designing Pathfinder 2, because the fans who did adopt early would in fact be sort of the evangelists and the boosters, and they had to be won over more than anyone else. But for my part, I would prefer a game that spoke for itself. And as I read Pathfinder 2, I see a game that is speaking for itself, but not speaking to me, because I don't really exist to Pathfinder 2.